July 1944, a forgotten airfield somewhere in England. The war reports talked about aces, new engines, miracle fuel systems. But nobody ever wrote about the men who kept the dead airplanes from being melted down for scrap. One of those ghosts in overalls was Staff Sergeant Joe Carter, 29-year-old mechanic who knew the sound of every cylinder on that field better than the sound of his own name. He wasn't a pilot, not an engineer, not a hero from the newspapers. He was the guy commanders called when they had already decided a machine was finished, just to get one last opinion before signing the paperwork. On a gray morning that smelled like wet canvas and burned fuel, a tow truck dragged in another corpse. It had been a proud fighter once. Now it was a patchwork of bullet holes and bent metal. The nose gear was twisted, one wingtip was chewed up like a shark bite, and the engine log read like a medical chart for a terminal patient. 3 emergency landings in 2 months, chronic overheating, power loss above 18,000 feet. Official status, not worth fixing. The brass wanted the airframe stripped, the engine pulled, and the rest sent to the smelter. Joe walked around it slowly, grease-blackened hands in his pockets, listening more than looking. Mechanics like him didn't start with the instruments or the reports. They started with smell, with the way the metal sat on its own landing gear, with the tiny crooked things pilots never noticed. He ran his palm along the cowling and stopped at a place where the paint felt slightly different, newer, heavier. Someone had patched a crack, painted over it, and prayed it would hold. It hadn't. The squadron commander was already impatient. "She's done, Carter. Command wants the engine. The rest goes to recycling. We've got new birds coming in with proper modifications. No point wasting hours on a dead horse." Joe didn't argue. He just asked for one thing, 48 hours, not to save the airplane, just to understand why it kept trying to die in the same way, on the same kind of mission, at the same altitudes. To everyone else, it was paperwork. To him, it was a riddle, and riddles bothered him more than overtime. That night, while the base quieted down and the pilots drifted off to their cots, the hangar lights stayed on. Joe pulled the cowling, stripped panels, traced fuel lines with a flashlight between his teeth. The official manuals, thick, stamped, written by engineers thousands of miles away, said the problem was simple. The airframe was tired, the engine worn, the design outdated. In a perfect world, that would have been true. But war did not live in perfect worlds. It lived in compromises, shortcuts, and temporary fixes that somehow became permanent doctrine. By 3 a.m., he had a list of sins that would have made the factory engineers faint. Field repairs that bent tolerances just a little. Replacement parts from other models that fit well enough. Cooling baffles installed backwards by crews who'd learned under fire, not in classrooms. None of this was in the official story of why this fighter was dying early. On paper, it was just another statistic. On Joe's workbench, it was a map, a proof that the airplane's real enemy wasn't just German flak. It was the way the book assumed nobody would ever have to push this machine past what the book allowed. By the second day, the picture was clear. The fighter wasn't failing because it was weak. It was failing because it had quietly been turned into something the designers never planned for. Heavier, hotter, and flown at power settings the manuals still treated like suicide. Pilots came back from missions swearing that if they kept babying the engine the way headquarters demanded, they would simply never catch anything. So they improvised. They pushed throttle, mixture, and RPM into combinations that worked well enough for aces, but murdered engines in the hands of average men. Joe had seen this pattern before, buried in the gossip of ground crews. One squadron swore by a slightly richer mixture that cooled the cylinders. Another swore the opposite: leaner, hotter, more miles per gallon. Everyone had a trick. Nobody had time to write a new manual. Command trusted numbers on paper more than stories from men whose uniforms smelled like burned oil. In theory, the engine should have been protected by strict limits. In practice, those limits were fantasy. That evening, as rain hammered the tin roof, Joe sat on an overturned ammo crate with a stack of worn notebooks, his private archive. Every time a pilot mentioned, "It felt better when I did this," he wrote it down. Every time a cylinder failed, he noted the power setting, the altitude, the fuel load. It wasn't science the way universities defined it. It was statistics written in carbon and blood. Somewhere in those scrawled numbers was an answer the official engineers had missed. The pattern that finally emerged was stupidly simple and terrifying. The airplane didn't die on its worst days. It died on its almost safe days. Heavy fuel, medium altitude, chasing targets just beyond where the original designers thought this fighter would ever go. The cooling system, perfect in a wind tunnel and at standard climb power, was suffocating at the power settings pilots used in real combat. The propeller pitch the manual called economical cruise was actually trapping heat in the cylinders when paired with the new fuel mix and the hastily installed field modifications. Joe did the forbidden math. If he changed the propeller governor setting slightly, let the blades bite deeper earlier, opened a few new paths for air through the cowling, and nudged the mixture recommendations off the sacred line on the chart, the engine would run cooler at higher power. Not a miracle, not magic. Just better matched to the way the war was really being flown, not the way it looked in training diagrams. Of course, on paper, this was heresy. The manuals warned in bold letters that such settings would lead to catastrophic failure. Ground schools repeated the same warning until young mechanics could recite it in their sleep. But the engine logs were already screaming a different truth. Obeying the book was killing engines faster than disobeying it. The official doctrine had been written for another war, another fuel, another tempo. When Joe brought his idea to the engineering officer, the reaction was immediate. No, absolutely not. We're not rewriting factory limits because one sergeant with a wrench thinks he's smarter than the men in white coats. If headquarters hears we're running engines over square or messing with governor settings, they'll shut this place down. The conversation should have ended there. Career-wise, that would have been safest. But the next morning, a pilot from B Flight limped home with the same symptoms the dead fighter had shown for months. Hot engine, power sag at altitude, emergency landing that bent yet another airframe. Watching the medics pull a burned, shaking kid out of the cockpit, the engineering officer's certainty cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but enough. He pulled Joe aside and spoke in a voice that didn't sound like a man quoting regulations anymore. One aircraft, one test. If we do this, nobody writes it down. If you're wrong, you and I both answer for it. They chose the dead fighter as their guinea pig. It was already written off. If Joe killed it on a test flight, the paperwork wouldn't look any different. Under the closed doors of the hangar, they worked like thieves. Cooling baffles were trimmed and realigned for the airflow they actually saw in climb, not the airflow the drawings assumed in clean, cold air. Small vents were opened where turbulent pockets cooked the rear cylinders. The propeller governor was adjusted so the engine would pull harder at lower RPM, trading useless noise for real thrust. Most radical of all was the invisible change, a new, unofficial power schedule. Instead of treating a certain manifold pressure as an emergency limit never to be touched, Joe mapped out combinations of RPM, mixture, and boost that his notebook suggested the engine could survive for hours, not minutes. It was a language of numbers only 2 men on that base understood, and both knew they could be court-martialed for speaking it aloud. When the modifications were done, the fighter didn't look different. No new fins, no dramatic scoops, no experimental weapons. To a passing officer, it was just another patched-up machine waiting to be towed to the edge of the boneyard. But the test pilot noticed the moment he taxied. The engine note was deeper, less frantic. Throttle response felt heavy, solid. The airplane seemed inexplicably more relaxed. They flew at dawn when the cloud base sat low, and the rest of the squadron was still choking down powdered eggs. Joe watched from the dispersal hut, a mug of coffee forgotten in his hand, as the fighter roared down the runway. The takeoff roll was shorter than any previous log entry for that airframe. The climb angle steeper. The tower cleared them to 10,000 feet, then 15,000, then 20,000. Each altitude was a grave marker in the old reports, the heights at which this machine had always started dying. This time, the radio stayed calm. No reports of rising temperatures, no requests to reduce power to be safe. The pilot's voice sounded almost bored as he read off engine readings that, in theory, should not have existed. Cooler heads at higher boost. Stable oil pressure at settings the manual treated like a last resort. After an hour, the test profile called for the real gamble. A combat climb and chase at the same settings frontline pilots used when they were desperate not to lose a target, vanishing into cloud. From the ground, the fighter was just a dot tracing loops in the thin morning light. Up there, though, an unofficial revolution was happening. The airplane that had been labeled untrustworthy under correct procedures was now flying harder, cleaner, and safer under settings the book had declared forbidden. When the pilot finally brought it back and rolled to a stop, he didn't bother hiding the grin on his face. He climbed down, helmet under his arm, and looked at Joe and the engineering officer like a man who'd just been handed a secret. "Whatever you two did, this isn't the same crate. She climbs like she's been cheating on the scales. I sat at power settings that used to send the needles marching into the red, and they just held. If you tell me this will kill the engine in a week, I don't care. Give every combat ship this setup, and we'll finish this war sooner." Joe didn't answer immediately. He was listening again, this time not to the engine, but to the cooling tick of metal as it settled. No ominous pings, no smell of burned oil. The mechanics moved in, pulling plugs, checking bores, reading the mechanical tea leaves. The verdict, written in clean metal and uncracked heads, was simple. The engine was healthier after an hour of forbidden power than it had been after 15 minutes of approved settings. News on a wartime airfield didn't travel through official channels first. It traveled in mess lines, smoke breaks, and tired jokes yelled across the maintenance pits. Within a week, pilots were accidentally scheduling themselves into the resurrected fighter. Nobody outside that field knew its serial number, but inside it already had a nickname: the Ghost. The airplane that had come back from the boneyard faster, calmer, and somehow more alive. Command tried to keep the experiment quiet. Officially, nothing had changed. The manuals were still sacred. Power limits were still printed in bold ink. But you can't hide performance. Patrol after patrol came back with the same comment in the debrief. The Ghost was using less fuel, getting to altitude earlier, and out-climbing machines with fresher engines. The logs showed fewer emergency landings, fewer overheats, fewer panicked calls for priority landing because an engine didn't feel right. Other crews started copying what little they could see. If a hole cut here made cooling better on one machine, maybe it would help on another. If a slightly different takeoff power setting shortened the run on that runway, maybe it wasn't suicide after all. The engineering officer found himself in a strange position, officially repeating doctrine about correct procedures, unofficially quietly passing Joe's scribbled notes to the most trusted crews. It couldn't last, of course. Nothing that worked this well stayed small in a war that chewed through men and metal every hour. A visiting inspector from Group Headquarters noticed the unauthorized modifications during a routine walk-around. Extra vents, slightly altered baffles, a propeller governor adjustment that did not match the serial's factory configuration. On paper, it was enough to ground the entire squadron and drag Joe in front of a board of inquiry. The confrontation happened in an office that smelled like stale paper and cold coffee. Charts on the walls showed ideal climb curves, perfect fuel consumption lines, and performance envelopes that might as well have been fairy tales compared to the mud and panic outside. The inspector slammed a folder onto the desk. "You are exceeding rated limits. You are altering certified systems without authorization. Do you understand the risk if this spreads? Engines will fail. Pilots will die." Joe did something mechanics weren't supposed to do. He talked back with numbers. Not the numbers in the manuals, the numbers on the maintenance logs, sortie reports, and casualty charts. He showed how many engines had failed under approved use, how many airframes had been lost obeying limits that didn't match reality, how the Ghost and the few ships that had quietly copied it were now surviving missions that had previously ended with maydays and smoking wrecks. The room went quiet as the inspector followed the columns with his finger. Fewer failures, longer ranges, better climb rates, no increase in catastrophic breakdowns. If anything, the engines coming off Joe's line were cleaner inside than those that had never been touched. The theory on which all those red lines in the manuals were based was colliding head-on with data from an ugly little airfield full of tired men who no longer believed in theory. Eventually, the inspector closed the folder and said the sentence that mattered most. "If this leaves this room as an official recommendation, half the engineering hierarchy from here to the factories will have to admit they were wrong. That will not happen in time to help the men flying tomorrow. So here is what we will do. I never saw this. You never wrote it down. But you will quietly bring every aircraft under your care up to this unofficial standard." It was as close to a blessing as they were going to get. No medals, no public acknowledgement, just a chance to turn one resurrected fighter into a pattern, one airfield at a time. For the rest of the war, Joe's work would spread the way all real innovations did at the front. Sideways through rumor and results, not downward through orders and signatures. Months later, nobody remembered exactly which sortie had been the Ghost's last. Airplanes in war didn't get gentle retirements. They either kept flying until a flak burst finally found them, or they were quietly written off after one landing. Too many went wrong. Somewhere over gray water or broken fields, that resurrected fighter probably ended the way so many others did. A column of smoke on a map and a brief sentence in a report. What did not disappear was what it had proven. In squadron after squadron, Factory Perfect stopped being the standard pilots trusted with their lives. Field Perfect, the messy combination of numbers, cuts, and tweaks born from experience, became the real gold. Younger mechanics were trained not just to repeat what the manual said, but to ask the question Joe had asked in that empty hangar. Is this limit real, or just convenient for someone far away? Years later, engineers back home would proudly present new fighters with engines and cooling systems that, magically, matched the kind of power settings frontline crews had been using in secret all along. White papers would describe breakthroughs in understanding mixture distribution, cowling aerodynamics, and propeller load. None of them would mention the sergeants who had tested those ideas with nothing but wrenches, instincts, and airframes the system had already decided to throw away. In the official histories, air superiority would be credited to big things: new propeller designs, advanced fuel chemistry, revolutionary engine controls. But fold back the pages, and there was always the same shadow story underneath, the one where a nameless mechanic in a forgotten hangar refused to accept that a dead fighter was beyond saving, and in trying to fix one airplane, accidentally rewrote what safe really meant. That's why this story matters. Not because Joe Carter was the only man who ever bent the rules to keep pilots alive, but because every war quietly depends on people like him, the ones who listen to what the machines are actually saying instead of what the charts insist they should say. The genius isn't in some dramatic cinematic discovery. It's in the stubborn refusal to look at a failing system and shrug. Somewhere in a box of unmarked photos, there's probably a black and white shot of the Ghost sitting on the line, looking no different from a dozen other fighters. No special nose art, no victory marks, just another airplane waiting for its next mission. But if you could step close enough, you'd see the tiny scars along the cowling where extra air found its way in, the subtle angle of the propeller blades at run-up, the quiet confidence in the mechanic's posture as he gives the pilot a thumbs up. To anyone else, it's just a routine launch. To the men who knew the truth, it's something else. Proof that sometimes the most dangerous idea in a war isn't a secret weapon or a new strategy. It's a simple, forbidden question asked by a man in greasy coveralls standing under a tired wing. What if the book is wrong and we can do better?